Well, good morning. I'm Robert Kelly. For those I haven't yet had a chance to meet, I'm one of the pastors here at the church, and around this time of the year I get a little bit nostalgic. It's the whole Christmas thing, it's the New Year's thing, it's the eating too much, it's the spending time with family and vacations and gift giving and all that warm fuzzy kind of stuff. And I like to use different seasons of the year to kind of look back and reflect. I think most of us try to do this, especially at the end of the year. We start to look back and kind of wonder and evaluate and think about what was the last year like and what does the new year hold and all of that kind of stuff. And this was really, for us as a church, this was really a year of questions. We started asking all sorts of questions. What would it be like to be the kind of church that God would have us to be? What will it mean? You know, we'd come up on our 5-year anniversary as a church. Who have we been? Who will we be? The time seemed to have flown by. And yet, as we looked back, we see that God had done so many neat things, and we had so many great stories to tell, and yet committed to this truth, this hope that the greatest days are still ahead, not behind. We started to ask, who will we be? And with a relentless sort of questioning this year, we've been doing that. We've been doing it on a personal level. These ordinary people serving an extraordinary God. Who will we be? And you know, when you have questions asked with earnestness, it's hard to refuse an answer. I feel like the scriptures tell us this, even about God. It's a very neat part about God and who He is. I'd heard a story about one of these Christmas pageants that you guys have seen throughout your lives, you know, where they have all the little characters from the Christmas story. And there's always the poor innkeeper. You know, that poor kid that has to, when Mary and Joseph come to the door and they knock on the door and the innkeeper opens up and, you know, Joseph pleads, please let us come in, please let us come in, you know, and this like usually some poor like third grader or something like that, you know. He's got one line in the entire pageant, right? What's his line? I'm sorry. There's no room for you in the inn, right? That's all he's got to say. This one little kid, you know, after Joseph came and pleaded with him, please let us in, we have nowhere to stay. He's like, well, okay, if it's that important to you. Do you imagine? There you go. There's the Christmas story. I guess they're actually in the inn in their version of the Christmas story. That's sort of like our God, too. You know, we ask Him questions, and He gives us these answers, and He asks us questions. And He expects answers from us. And as we kind of look back over 2010 and sort of figure out where we've been and where we're going, it's helpful for us to start to ask questions of each other, of who we will be as a church, of who we will be as individuals. You know, we look at the scriptures, and throughout our 2010 series, we've been trying to figure out what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we've taken this last series of the year, and we sort of only sort of nodded at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we told a little bit of the story in other ways, but we really just kept plugging through the Gospel of Mark, trying to figure out what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, and what will the implications be for us as a church. And that is the question I'm going to end this year with you guys as well. Are we followers of Jesus? Are we disciples of Jesus? You know, maybe you like church. Maybe that's just your thing. Maybe you like the music, or you like the warm feeling, or you like coming out and hanging out a little bit and kind of, you know, having that list of things you ought to do in your week, and God's a part of that, and so you get your check box. You know, maybe that's is that what it means to be a disciple? I mean, from what we've been looking at in the Gospel of Mark, not even close. You know, maybe we think that our religion is kind of this personal thing. We keep our faith, you know, in here, close to our hearts, but we don't really do anything else with it. We've seen over the last weeks, that's not what it means to be a follower of Jesus. You can't not get that thing inside of you out if it really has been put in there by God. You know, we talk about what it means to sort of nibble around the edges of the gospel message, the Christian message. We kind of nibble around the edges. We like this part, and so we'll nibble here, we'll nibble there, we'll nibble there. But really, is there any nibbling around the life of Jesus and the call that He made on His disciples? He was calling us to so much more. He was making promises of a fullness of life they would outstrip anything that we had previously seen. He starts off a whole new section of our story in the Gospel of Mark with a simple question. Who do people say that I am? And then he turns it around and he says, who do you say that I am? We're going to look at this passage because in many ways it is a transitional time here in the Gospel of Mark. We're not going to finish the Gospel of Mark. You guys realize that, right? Because we're like chapter 8. We are finishing the first half. And it's often referred to as the introduction for the book of Mark, the first 8 chapters. Because Mark is all about the cross of Christ. It's all about the sacrifice of Christ. But right here we come to a transition point. Everything before it in many ways has been an introduction. It's been a call to follow the Jesus who's about to be revealed from chapter 9 to the very end. In fact, he confronts everybody with this simple question. Look at we're looking at Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 27. Mark chapter 8, verse 27. We've seen some amazing miracles that have happened up to this point. We know that this gospel was written to probably in the city of Rome or to the city of Rome, something like this, by Mark, one of the apostles. We know that there was a great time of persecution going on and soon to happen and unleash on the church. We know that all of that is some of the background here. And what we find in verse 27 is this simple question. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked them, who do people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. You see, Jesus confronts everyone with this question. And you know what? Everyone's got an opinion. Everyone. Go ahead and ask people randomly, who do you think Jesus is? The multitude of answers you will get, especially here in New York. You know, some people have a great deal of information, and some people think they have a great deal of information, and we have people from every type of religious background, ethnic background. Everybody has an opinion about Jesus. There's a whole big movement that you guys may have heard about, the search for the historical Jesus, the Jesus Seminar. They explore all of the ancient documents and they try to figure out, who is this Jesus? He's some sort of a mystic. He's some sort of an itinerant preacher. Maybe he's a prophet. Maybe he was a good man. Some would even go so far as to say, because of the evidence we have in the scriptures, that he was some sort of a miracle worker. He was able to do things that others weren't. That sort of explains why people followed him and why crowds would be attracted to him. These are historical documents. We have to do something with this information. There must have been something unusual or compelling about him. Others would say, no, that was all written in later on. Nobody really buys any of this stuff. If you're smart, if you're educated, you'd understand that Jesus is a fraud. See, everybody's got an opinion about who Jesus is. We just read through the newspapers and the magazines, and you'll always find it. Sometimes it's stated, and sometimes it's sort of just implied, and sometimes they like to sort of get it out there, like only smart people always feel this way about Jesus, and you ignorant people, you would feel the other way and believe in the kind of miraculous side of things. Everyone's got an opinion, and everyone has to come to terms with this question: who do they say that I am? Jesus throws it out there. He kind of lays it out there. And you know what? It's so, I look at, the myriad of possibilities. And, it can be a little overwhelming. It can be a little overwhelming. And some of the positions aren't even thought out, and others seem to have all sorts of historical information behind them. But Mark, the way Mark uses it, to me is very fascinating. Mark makes it a turning point in his story. If you were to think through where we've been in the Gospel of Mark, it's been these grand old miracles, big public events, crowds of people clamoring to get close to him. He's teaching the multitudes. He's traveling and all this. It's this big stuff happening. From here on out, it's getting quieter. From here on out, he moves from the crowds and he moves into teaching quietly with his disciples. He doesn't do a lot of teaching in the early part. Not that many parables in the early part. Now he's going to start talking a whole lot more to the disciples and teaching them in parables and teaching the people quietly. There's very few of the grand miracles we've seen. There's a transition. We also see it geographically. You should notice he says here that they went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. Kind of an interesting point for this to be, a place for this to be happening. This little city is at the furthest reaches of what you would still consider Israel. It was very much a pagan-influenced city. It was as far from Jerusalem and the temple that you could get and still be in Israel. It was as far away as you could possibly get, culturally and physically. From this point on, in the way that Mark tells the story, everything from here on is a march toward Jerusalem. From this moment on, everything's been vague. Mark hasn't told us where they were. He sort of gave hints and told us a little bit of the location in the city, and they were in an area in the wilderness. Now Mark, he nails a city, and from here on out, he outlines the path. And each one he mentions is getting him a step closer to Jerusalem. Because it was all about what was going to happen in Jerusalem. And here, in the shadow of Rome, in the midst of the greatest physical empire the world had ever seen, Jesus turns this question and he says to them, well, who does the world say that I am? Who are all of these people? Pagan Romans, religious Jews. Who are all of these Gentiles? And who do they say that I am? And of course, at that moment, he's also about to turn the question on his disciples much more directly. He asked them in verse 29, but what about you? He asked, who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you are the Christ. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. There's a story about a grandma. She spent some time she's spending some time with her grandkids, and the grandma's kind of just trying to speak the language of the grandkids, and so she decides to ask her granddaughter the questions, like kind of quizzing her granddaughter a little bit and asking her about colors. So, honey, sweetheart, do you know what color this is? That's red, Grandma. Very good. That's so good. She's like, and what about this color? Do you know what this color is? Well, that's green. She goes on for a few different ones. And this color? Well, that's purple. She finally asks her another one, and the frustrated little girl says, Grandma, you're going to have to start learning these colors for yourself. Because, of course, she thinks Grandma's asking these questions for Grandma's knowledge, but she isn't. She's asking these questions for her little girl to help the granddaughter along, and that's what's going on here. Jesus isn't looking for information, guys. We got to know this about him by now. He's trying to get at the heart of where we're at with him. Who is it that you say that I am? Lots of opinions out there. Lots of research you need to do. Who do you say that I am? And as far from the temple as you could get and still be in Israel, Peter nails it. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You are the promised one. You are the hope of the ages. You are the conqueror of Rome. You're the destroyer of all of the kingdoms that set themselves up against God. Every power and every force that sets itself up against God, destroyed by you. This is why the naming of Jesus as Christ was such a profound moment. This was huge. This is a turning point. In all of these stories, this question and the answer to this question is the single most important thing that you can wrestle with. Who do you say he is? Who is he to you? Who will he be to you? Do you see him as the exalted Christ, the King, the Messiah? And what does that now mean? How does that play out? Peter gets an A+. He's absolutely just a stunning moment. I love the fact that it's sort of in the shadow of Rome, and he's in nearly pagan lands, and he's like, yes, all of the power of Rome is around us, but it's nothing compared to the promise of Messiah found in Jesus. And yet, I think many people get very close to the truth, and they still somehow miss it. There's a woman in Michigan, and she had hurt her shoulder somehow. And so she went into the emergency room. This was months ago that she had hurt it, and it was, something more systemic and chronic. And they told her, "I'm sorry, we can't work on your shoulder. It's not an emergency. You came to the emergency room." And she's like, "Yeah, but I got to get it fixed." And they said, "Yeah, but you don't have insurance. Like, we could help you if you were in dire need, but we can't fix your shoulder. We don't do, surgeries like this here in the emergency room. We would only save your life if something was life-threatening." And so she went out and shot herself in the shoulder. She shot herself. Can you imagine that? Because, of course, her rationale is she's going to go back into the emergency room and they're going to fix everything that's wrong. We got to give her points for ingenuity. I mean, that is a great move. Of course, they stopped the bleeding. They took out the bullet. They fixed the shoulder and didn't fix the underlying problem. So she was, in her article, they asked her about it, and she said, "It didn't really work out the way I had planned." I would imagine not. You shot yourself, and it got you nowhere. And we often do this. We have an answer. We're close to the truth. We sort of think we get it, and we get this A-plus moment. And how do we do it? Well, we offer up our CCD answer. We offer up our catechism answer. We remember the Apostles' Creed, and so we reference it, and who's Jesus to you? Well, he was born of a virgin, and, we know he's important, and we know he's somehow the king and God and Savior and all of that kind of stuff. And, we often come up along close to it. If you're not a cynic, if you're not an outright skeptic, then you might come up along pretty close to the right answer. Who do you say he is? Well, I got all the right answers. I learned all of these things. I go to church. I like church. I read. I'm fairly educated. Because of that means I get it. But we can get so close and yet still miss it. Take a look at verse 31. After he had warned them not to tell anybody about him, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's an important transition here as well, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Wow. Verse 33. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. See, you can't be a disciple. You cannot be a follower of Jesus unless you get this question right. They often wonder, why did he tell them not to tell anyone? I think we just figured out why. Because they didn't actually get it. They had a right answer. They had a title. But they failed to grasp the fullness of what that meant for them. They can't go on and start to tell people about this. See, they understand. They're out there in the outskirts of Israel, and they're on their way to Jerusalem. And with that, they see all the promises of the Messianic kingdom about to be fulfilled. That's why when he tells them the Son of Man has to suffer and die, Peter's like, that's not actually what I just said. When I said you were the Christ, I meant you were going to kick out the Romans. I meant that you were going to get rid of all of these false teachers. You were going to throw out the priests and put us in their place. We were going to have victory. You were going to stop all of this wickedness and paganism. You weren't going to die. Remember the Christ thing? That was a good answer. I thought we were on the same page. You can't talk like this. I heard a story about, you guys just recently, a guy jumped in the subway. There's always a guy jumping in the subway to save someone, right? You guys hear about this? An elderly man fell into the subway and this guy jumped in. I always love these stories. I'm like, that's gutsy, man. I wonder what I would do if ever faced with that situation. Would I be able to jump in there and, try it? Well, this guy, I was like, yeah, here we go. Another guy, Carlos, I think was his name. Carlos Flores, 36 years old. He jumped in. Did you hear why he jumped in? Because he didn't want to be late for work. That's what he said. He's like, yeah, if this guy gets hit by a train, I'm going to be out of work. It's a Sunday. I get time and a half on Sundays. There's so many things right and wrong with that story. I can't even tell you. Really? You jumped in because you were, oh man, I got to get this guy out of I don't even know if you get points in heaven for that kind of a thing. It seemed like a good thing at the time, but really, was it really a good thing? All of these kind of mixed motive, this bag of things. And here's Peter with this great confession, and Jesus is saying, listen, this Messiah thing, you're right, I am the Christ. But I'm actually the Son of Man. I'm the Messiah in a Son of Man sort of way. Did you notice that? He began, right after this confession of him as Christ, verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man, it's a very interesting term. The Son of Man is a phrase that scholars debate endlessly. Volumes have been written about this phrase because no one really quite gets it. What we do know about it is that Jesus loved it as a self-designation. He referred to himself as the Son of Man all the time. So you go back into the Old Testament and you try to figure out what does Jesus mean when he calls himself the Son of Man. And you find it scattered throughout the Old Testament. It's not a dominant idea in most places, but it's out there. But he loved it. He called himself the Son of Man all the time in situations like this. And now for the rest of Mark, you're going to see him referring to himself another dozen times probably as the Son of Man. So you get to Daniel, the book of Daniel, one of the Old Testament prophets, and he talks about the Son of Man. And in Daniel, the Son of Man is this messianic king. He's the one who's going to come and conquer all of the empires of this world. He's going to undo all of the evil and bring in a golden age. So you look at that and you go, there it is, the Son of Man. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying he is this kind of a Messiah. But then you get to the book of Ezekiel. And this is where the Son of Man shows up most in the Old Testament. Ezekiel is called the Son of Man. I can't help but imagine that if you were a reader of the Old Testament, if you were a good Jew of the first century, and you heard Jesus talking about this Son of Man, your mind would have naturally gone to Daniel and a couple of the Psalms, but I think you would have kept wondering, why is he referring so much to Ezekiel? Ezekiel is an unusual prophetic book. Very, very complex. This is part of the reason why the Son of Man theology is so challenging. But in Ezekiel, he promises the nation of Israel that the temple is going to be destroyed. He tells them the temple is going to be destroyed. This is catastrophic for the Jewish nation, because at the temple is where the presence of God rested, the Shekinah glory of God. And when that presence of God left, now Israel was open for the possibility of destruction and deceit. Now, with the temple, the promise of the temple being to be destroyed, you follow along in Ezekiel, what comes next? Israel is ransacked. The nation is wiped out. The presence of God has left them. Where does Ezekiel end? He ends with the restoration of all things, with the forgiveness of God coming in, with Israel as a suffering nation being brought out of their suffering. See, when you begin to mix all of these ideas together, I think Mark is saying Jesus recognized this final march, that this movement from Caesarea Philippi ever deeper into Israel, to Jerusalem, to the point where he would go to the temple, where he would cleanse the temple, where he would tell the leaders, this temple is going to be destroyed. I'm going to tear it. If you tear it down, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. See, there's all of this identification of himself with the temple of God, because he was the ultimate temple. He was the presence of God, and his body was going to be torn down, broken down. And that breaking down was going to give to us a pathway back to God. This is the kind of a Messiah that Peter couldn't have. He couldn't have the suffering kind of Messiah. Now, I think for each of us, you look at this story of Peter and you go, really? How could this possibly be? Peter's going to have none of this kind of a Christ. And we're like, really? What kind of chutzpah does it take to do that kind of a thing? To confront Jesus in this way? What kind of chutzpah does it take? Now, you guys may have heard of this thing. It's a stereopticon. It's an optical device. They've done a study where they can make a person see two different images with two different eyes with this machine. Some of you guys have heard about this. They test vision this way, right? The brain doesn't like seeing two different images. The brain tries to resolve these things. And so this thing called a stereopticon, they've done this study where in one eye they let you see a football player, and in the other eye they let you see a bullfighter. And then they went and took people from like North America and from Europe, and they showed them this little device and they split their vision. But your brain will fix it so you only see one. The people from North America, you can guess what they saw. The football player. The people from Europe, they saw the bullfighter. Because we are very much trained to see things in a certain way. And this is what goes on with a lot of people. We have a picture of who God ought to be. And we look at Peter and we go, really, Peter, have you lost your mind? It's Jesus that you're talking to. And yet, isn't this what we do? We tell Jesus the kind of Jesus we want. We tell God the kind of God we want. We explain to him, I feel like you ought to bless me in this way. You ought to explain, you gotta relate to me in the way that I want you to relate to me. If you do it on my terms like this, then we're good. And we take this relationship with Jesus, we look at a table like this, we're like, oh, thank you for your great gift. Now, if you could provide for me in this way, I'm gonna follow you. I'm gonna give you a part of my life. If I can get rid of some of those teachings I don't like, if I can follow you in just the ways that I am comfortable with, we're good. Because the table, the presence of God in my life is so important. You see, we're back and forth. We want the fullness of this, but we really want him, we want to take pieces of the message. You think, oh, come on, we don't really do that. But we do it all the time. We read through the scriptures, we don't like something. I've heard people tell me many a time, I would never follow a God like that. You mean a God like the one described in the Bible? Because you can decide either to follow the God that's described in the Bible or a God of your own making. If you follow a God of your own making, you're pulling Jesus aside and you're rebuking him and you're telling him, no, you can't be that kind of Messiah. See, he stands against every time, every culture, and he brings his influence into our world, and he pulls us apart in a way that is unbelievably challenging and unbelievably painful for us, in ways that we don't like, and yet he insists that there is no other way to do it. We see it in a certain way. We want a God of a certain style, a certain kind. And he says, absolutely not. When a person comes to me and says, this thing happened to me, but I know that God would never do that. I always have this pause. I'm like, really? Are you sure? Because he's done a lot of things that I wouldn't have seen as the best or the first move to make in a situation like this. What does it mean to submit our lives to him? I think for us, we like to treat him like a genie in the lamp sometimes. We rub the lamp, we get our wishes. We kind of bottle him up when we don't want him to intrude, and then when we need his help, we kind of let him out again to kind of do his thing for us. Jesus is challenging all of these kinds of assumptions, and with a ferocity that is really unprecedented. This is Peter. What are the great two, the famous apostles? I don't want to say the great, the famous apostles. Most of you would say, well, Peter, that's why he has the basilica named after him, right? St. Peter's Basilica, like the Pope hangs out there. It's got to be a good place. This is St. Peter's, and who's the other one? Everyone knows this guy, Judas. Both of these guys are known around the world, the betrayer and the faithful one. And they're both associated with Satan. Isn't that amazing? Satan came and tempted Judas, and Judas went out and hung himself. Here, Jesus comes to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. After he looks at the apostles, he calls their leader Satan. Wow! What ferocity! This was a brutal moment. It could have hardened anyone's heart. And yet, what do we see happening with Peter? He doesn't get it. We know he doesn't quite understand. We know he's still going to have moments of weakness. But what's the difference between these apostles? Both of them were associated with Satan. Both of them were warned and rebuked. One of them decided that they would not serve a God like that. They would not serve a Messiah like that. And the other one decided he would. That he would submit. That he would understand. That he would seek to understand. That he would allow this to unfold and embrace Christ no matter what kind of Christ he was to him. When when we start to see this, we pick it up the story in verse 34. And this is really kind of where Jesus was going with all of what's happening in the Gospel of Mark. Verse 34. Then he called the crowd to them along with his disciples and said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Denial of self is the key way to pursue a life of discipleship with God. Denial of self. The problem is, most of us understand the denial of self as denying ourselves stuff. Everyone stand up just for a quick moment here. Everyone stand up. If all of you are the things and the people in my life, you're the things and the people, you're all of the things that are connected to me in some way, right? I'm in the center of them. And I want all of them related to me in the way that I want them to. Now what I do is God comes along and he says to me, there's something about this picture I don't really like. You need to deny yourself. So what do? We say, all right, I'm sorry, you're no good for me anymore. Could you please sit down? Wait, the rest of you here, you can all stay up because you're good. You know what, you're not actually very good for me either, so could you please sit down? Because God, and you might be good, but you're not good for me at this time of my life. So I deny myself things or people. This is how we often understand denying ourselves. We say, you know, if you could just sit down, just please sit down for me, that's great, because now I'm without, and that somehow makes me holy. Because something has been taken away from me, I'm somehow good. But you guys see, the picture hasn't changed. I'm still in the center of things. Would you all sit down a second? So, what is God saying? He's saying, what if this were God? And what if this were me? And what if you were all of the things in my world? He's not talking about denying things of yourself, like Lent. You know, we go to Lent, we take something away so that we can be close to God. That's not denying yourself. He's talking about the denial of self. The denial of self. Not the things like this. But this is the right relationship. If this were God, if this were the table, and I am standing here, God is now in the center of the story of my life. And all of the things, all of the people are now filtered through Him. See, we deny ourselves things and we're still in the center of the story. God wants none of that. We tell God, you can have a part of my life. He doesn't want a part of your life. He will take it all or nothing. I don't like that. Too demanding. Well, you've picked. You've chosen what type of Messiah you want. He wants all of life filtered through Him. He stands at the center of it. He gives. He takes away. He blesses. He pulls challenges and burdens and rebuke upon your life. And we submit ourselves and our hearts to Him. For some reason, most likely because of His incredible love for us, He will have it no other way. Unless we are looking to deny self, stop being the center of the story, He will have none of it with us. He insists on it all, or He tells you, fine. Then you can stay in the center of your universe with all of the ramifications and all of the danger that that represents. When we as a church get to a place where we start to understand this more and more, that the way of the disciple is this unexpected path of self-denial and of death so that we might get life, when we begin to take these warnings of God seriously. It doesn't matter if, we get a title right or not. It doesn't matter if we think we've got a couple of the good answers, and it doesn't matter if we feel like we're giving up a little bit of ourselves for Him and we're pursuing Him and we're nibbling around the edges. None of that is what matters. To follow Him wholeheartedly with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength is to surrender self to Him. When He says, "Who do you say that I am?" He's our all. He is everything. All of life will be will be structured and situated around him. He will impact every decision, every relationship, everything, every way we spend our time. He will impact them all. That's what he wants from us. A fullness of consecration, a settledness in our own hearts and minds that his way is the best way, regardless of whether we see it. A submission, a confidence. And when that happens, we begin to see ourselves get absorbed as we learn about him, we pray to him, we read the scriptures, we worship together. We see our lives start to be transformed with character and integrity as the fruit of the Spirit starts to overflow. Love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness. We wonder why it is suddenly we're talking more about him to our friends and neighbors and people far away, people that are far from God. Why is it that we can't stop talking about him? Why is it that we have to tell them about the beauty and the wonder and the love of Jesus? Because he is our all in all. Because he sits at the center of our heart, because we have forsaken selfish desires for the desires of God. And with that come all of the promises of the kingdom of God that the follower of Christ, the disciple of Jesus, has been promised. Would you guys pray with me? Lord, as we come to an end to our study in Mark and to this year, we're asking that you would prepare our hearts for what you have ahead of us for 2011. You had a relentless march into the heart of Jerusalem, where the temple, your body, would be destroyed, where the sacrifice of the cross would forever change history. It would be a turning point, unlike any we had ever seen or known. And after that, you called us, Lord, into your family, to be your people, the called out ones, a community of faith that spans time and space. You knit us together, Lord, into one body. And you've called us to do your work, giving us a hope and a privilege beyond anything we could have hoped or imagined. You are the fulfiller of dreams, and you are the tear down of strongholds. All those things opposed to you will fail. May you give us the fullness of consecrated hearts that we need. You give us the courage to stand for you above all else. May you be the center of all that we are each and every day. May you forever be on our hearts and minds. May we pray